Hello everybody, I'm back with a new video. This week I wanted to talk a bit about genre fiction. It gets a bad rap, and I think that largely that comes down to style. If you watch my last video, you'll know that style is an important thing in fiction. Your writing can even be dismissed if your style is considered inauthentic or, in other ways, wrong. Genre fiction, though, does not always have this caveat. There are plenty of famous examples that commit stylistic sins. You can read Harry Potter and you'll see an overuse of adverbs and occasionally clunky, overlong sentence structures. Lord of the Rings could be said to have excessive exposition. Frodo is walking in the forest and Tolkien takes 2 pages to explain the history of a tree. I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea. Or any number of paperback thrillers where there's thin characters propelled by a flimsy plot, and yet they sell millions. I'm not disparaging these books or these types of books. I mean, I grew up on Harry Potter, and I still love the series. And, of course, Lord of the Rings is a milestone of fantasy fiction. We wouldn't have Game of Thrones and many other series without it. And there are also plenty of well-written thrillers. I'm just mentioning it because these books often teach poor style for those wanting to write literary fiction, or even write better genre fiction. But for this video, I don't really want to focus on that. I want to focus on the things, or really the one thing, that genre fiction is incredibly good at, which is to tell an entertaining story. If you look at many of today's bestsellers, you'll find an overwhelming amount of genre novels, such as, Stephen King, he always sells well, Gillian Flynn, who wrote Gone Girl, and many others. On our screens, fantasy and sci-fi has been a mainstay for years and is only growing in popularity. Game of Thrones, for example, is one of the highest rated and also most pirated and most discussed TV shows today, and it's a high fantasy series. So why are these so popular? Things happen in these books in a way that they don't happen in more character-driven literary fiction. The average reader quickly becomes far too engrossed to notice whether or not these books are well written or not. And often, as in the examples of Stephen King and others, they are actually well written. I'm just giving an example, because sometimes they're not even. So, what can genre fiction teach us about telling a gripping story? Why is it important to read genre fiction? All these great works of fiction are well structured. This applies to literary fiction and genre fiction, and they have compelling characters. But within literary fiction, at least, these are so subtly rendered that it becomes hard to learn from them, hard to really understand how they work, at least at a conscious level. To give you a concrete example, I want to compare a work of genre fiction, the original Star Wars film, with The Great Gatsby. And I want to look at their structures in particular. So Star Wars is a film with a clear 3-act structure. For those that don't know what 3-act structure is, it's a term that you hear more often in film, but it can apply to any form of writing. It's often considered to be formulaic, but it's a good starting point for those wanting to learn about story structure. It basically just says each story has 3 acts, like basically a beginning, a middle, and an end, with the second act being the longest of these. So you'll see this in action as I talk about Star Wars. So the action unfolds like so. We have a short prologue on the rebel ship, and then we meet Luke Skywalker, the protagonist. He's living with his aunt and uncle on a moisture farm in Tatooine. This introduces what is called the status quo, which is the comfortable situation in which the story starts. Then Luke's Uncle Owen buys R2-D2 and C-3PO, and Luke hears R2's message to Princess Leia. This is what is called the inciting incident. It strengthens Luke's desire for an adventure, and shortly after, when R2 escapes to look for Obi-Wan, this desire is met. It's the inciting incident because it incites the rest of the story. It incites Luke to take action, which allows the story to occur. The first act then ends when Luke's aunt and uncle are murdered by stormtroopers, and Luke commits to joining Obi-Wan on his mission. This is called the first act turning point. The second act comprises the meeting and hiring of Han Solo and the entirety of the scenes on the Death Star. The second act ends with Obi-Wan's death. This scene once again teaches Luke something and brings about a change in his character, and can thus be thought of as the second act turning point. The third act consists of the Death Star trench run, and the climax of the film comes with Luke's Force-led victory shot. The film then resolves with the medal ceremony. The structure of this film is clear and easy to follow. Each action Luke takes is true to his character, and each major turning point in the film teaches Luke something and forces him to grow. This is great structure and great storytelling, and this explains in part why Star Wars films are so beloved today, and also in part why the prequels and the later sequels are not so beloved. They are far more structurally messy. But that's an issue for another time. So then compare that to The Great Gatsby. Firstly, who is the protagonist in The Great Gatsby? Normally, it would be the narrator. But Nick Carraway is not the protagonist of The Great Gatsby. He is far too inactive. He doesn't really do anything. He's just observing the action of the story. No. The protagonist is Gatsby himself. Though he takes a while to be introduced to, he is the character with the clearest goal and the one with whom readers most sympathise, and therefore he is clearly the protagonist. But then we can ask, what is the inciting incident of Gatsby's story? I would argue myself that it is his initial meeting with Daisy before he goes to war. This is where he falls in love with her, and to an extent she with him, and fuels his obsession with her that forms the central drama of his character arc and most of the novel. The problem here is that this comes later in the novel as a sort of flashback. And then if we were to sort of talk about it as a three-act structure, the acts are not clearly demarcated either. It's hard to say, where the story turns, though you could point to some instances, if you liked, but it could be argued. The only thing that's really clear is that the climax comes with the hit-and-run death of Tom Buchanan's mistress, Myrtle. So, The Great Gatsby is a great novel. And the reason that it worked with this structurally advanced plot is that Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald, was a master. He didn't need to rely on three-act structure. He was able to craft something far more complex than a film like Star Wars, which in turn helped him to bring richness to his characters and the opulent world he was describing. But for a student of storytelling, it's far harder to learn good story structure from this book than from something as clearly structured as Star Wars or other works of genre fiction. And bear in mind, too, that Star Wars is actually perhaps even clearer than other examples of genre fiction, though I think that the argument still stands with genre fiction as a whole. But basically, because F. Scott Fitzgerald was such a skilled writer, he pulled off this structurally complex novel. But for us mortals, we have to first learn 3-act structure, the hero's journey, and other common structures before we try our hand at something complicated. If you're wondering what the hero's journey is, there's a book by Joseph Campbell, or a great video on YouTube where Dan Harmon explains it. I can link that in the description. So there are plenty of other things that genre fiction can teach you, all for much the same reason. These are plot-driven stories, so you can learn about the basics, at least, of creating complex characters, of world building, of dialogue and subtext through reading or watching genre stories, because the way that these elements work here are often, though not always, you see Game of Thrones and a few other instances, far clearer and more simplified than in works by literary masters. So don't shy away from reading genre fiction because of the style. This is not to say that style should be dismissed entirely. If something's poorly written, then, that's up to you whether you read it or not. If the story's cliched, you're probably not going to learn much, even if you pick up a bit of structural stuff. Read the good guys: Margaret Atwood, Ursula Le Guin, George R.R. Martin, Stephen King, Stephen Erickson, who wrote the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and there are plenty of others that are masters of genre fiction and whose style is whose writing is perfectly readable, if unflashy. These are entertaining stories, quick reads. They won't take long for you to read, usually, because they're so compelling. You can't really hurt, and you'll almost certainly learn as much, if not more, about how to compel audiences if you let these stories teach you how. So those are my thoughts on genre fiction. I hope you enjoyed it. As usual, you can find the text version of this video down in the description. Bit less rambly. Please subscribe, like, share this video, comment below with any questions or thoughts. You can join my Facebook discussion group, the Writers Network, in the description as well. Or follow me on Facebook and Twitter. At Twitter, at IshanMG. Ishan_MG, sorry. And my business page on Facebook is Ishan Morris Gray Writer. Again, I'll link those down there, along with that Dan Harmon video that I talked about just before. So thank you for watching. Join me next week for another video. Thanks.